The Georgian townhouse in Hampstead, London, stood like a monument to everything wealth could purchase. 5 bedrooms across 4 stories, original Victorian moldings, a private garden backing onto the heath, and an estimated value of £4.2 million. On the morning of March 8, 2021, Metropolitan Police received a call from the property at 6:47 a.m. The voice on the line was calm, measured, with the refined accent of British upper-middle-class education. "I've killed my wife. I'd like to report a murder. My own. I'm the perpetrator." When officers arrived 11 minutes later, they found Richard Thornton, 60-year-old retired investment banker, sitting in his drawing room drinking tea beneath a portrait of his late first wife. Upstairs in the master bedroom, they found the body of Angelica Thornton, née Santos, 28 years old, dead approximately 3 hours with ligature marks around her neck and evidence of prolonged strangulation. On the bedside table, arranged with eerie precision, lay documents that told a story of systematic deception. A secret mobile phone containing messages to a boyfriend in Manila, bank transfer records showing money being siphoned from Richard's accounts, and most damningly, a wedding certificate from the Philippines dated 6 months before Angelica had even met Richard. A marriage she'd never disclosed, making her UK marriage bigamous and her spousal visa fraudulent. "I gave her everything," Richard told the arresting officers without being questioned, his voice carrying the bewildered tone of a man whose entire worldview had just collapsed. "A home, citizenship, security, love. She was using me the entire time. Just using me. For papers. For money. For her real husband back in Manila." But as investigators peeled back layers of this case, they discovered that the story of the old wealthy man deceived by the scheming young immigrant was far more complex than initial appearances suggested. This wasn't just about immigration fraud or gold-digging manipulation. It was about loneliness weaponized by the marriage industry, desperation packaged as romance, and 2 people from catastrophically different worlds who collided with fatal consequences. How does a love story become a murder? What happens when retirement dreams built on internet romance crash against the reality of transactional marriage? And why do wealthy Western men keep believing that youth, beauty, and devotion can be purchased from impoverished women, then turn violent when they discover that poverty forces people to make survival choices that look like betrayal? Today's case exposes the dark underbelly of international marriage brokers, the visa fraud networks operating in plain sight, and what happens when entitled grief transforms into homicidal rage. Richard Thornton believed he'd rescued a grateful young woman from poverty. Angelica Santos believed she'd found an escape route from circumstances that would have killed her slowly. Both were partially right. Both were catastrophically wrong. And in a Hampstead bedroom where original Georgian windows overlooked one of London's most exclusive neighborhoods, their mutual deceptions ended with hands around a throat and a life extinguished before breakfast. Richard William Thornton was born in 1961 in Guildford, Surrey, into the kind of comfortable middle-class existence that defined post-war Britain's aspirational classes. His father managed a regional bank branch. His mother volunteered with church committees and garden societies. Richard attended a decent grammar school, earned respectable marks, and followed the prescribed path. Economics degree from University of Durham, entry-level position at Barclays Investment Bank in 1983, steady climb through corporate hierarchy. By 1995, at 34, Richard was earning 6 figures as a senior investment analyst specializing in emerging markets. He married his university girlfriend, Catherine Hargreaves, in a traditional ceremony at her family's parish church in the Cotswolds. They purchased the Hampstead townhouse in 1998 for £780,000. A stretch at the time, but a decision that would prove extraordinarily lucrative as London property values exploded. Richard's career peaked in the early 2000s. He made managing director at 42, earned bonuses that sometimes exceeded his £250,000 base salary, and built an investment portfolio that granted early retirement at 55. He wasn't billionaire wealthy, but comfortably millionaire, liquid assets around £3.2 million plus the property. His marriage was stable if unexciting. Catherine worked as a solicitor specializing in family law. They had no children, not from inability but from perpetually deferred decisions, always finding reasons why the timing wasn't quite right. Their relationship settled into the comfortable routine of professional couples whose partnership was based more on compatible life trajectories than passionate romance. Cancer destroyed that comfortable existence. Catherine was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in September 2016. She declined rapidly, dying in January 2017 after 4 months of suffering that left Richard traumatized and guilt-ridden. They'd planned to travel more after his retirement, to finally prioritize their relationship over careers. Instead, he spent her final months watching her waste away, their last conversations dominated by pain management and funeral arrangements rather than expressions of love. Grief devastated Richard in ways he couldn't articulate to friends who offered condolences and invitations he declined. He retreated into the Hampstead house, haunted by Catherine's absence in every room, by the future they'd planned but would never experience. At 56, recently retired and newly widowed, Richard faced the terrifying question. What now? His children from Catherine's first marriage, she'd been previously married briefly in her 20s, suggested he travel, pursue hobbies, perhaps volunteer. His colleagues from banking days encouraged him to consult or join corporate boards. But Richard felt paralyzed by the emptiness that Catherine's death had revealed. He'd spent 30 years building wealth and postponing life, and now he had money but no one to share it with. Loneliness at 56 feels different than loneliness at 26. At 26, loneliness is a temporary condition that will obviously be resolved. At 56, especially for a widower whose social circle consisted primarily of other couples, loneliness feels like a permanent state. Richard tried rejoining social groups but found himself the awkward single man at dinner parties, the reminder of mortality that made other couples uncomfortable. British women his age, the ones he met at gallery openings and National Trust events, seemed either uninterested or intimidating. They had their own careers, their own properties, their own established lives that didn't have convenient spaces for grieving widowers. The few dates Richard attempted through traditional channels ended awkwardly, both parties realizing they were performing courtship without actual attraction or connection. In August 2018, 18 months after Catherine's death, a former colleague mentioned over lunch that he'd recently married a Filipino woman he'd met through an international introduction service. "Best decision I ever made," he said enthusiastically. "These women appreciate what we offer. They're not jaded like British women our age. They want families, traditional roles, and they're genuinely grateful for the opportunity." The description appealed to something deep in Richard's psyche. He didn't want an equal partner who challenged him. He'd had that with Catherine, and it had been fine but exhausting. He wanted someone who'd be grateful, who'd appreciate his wealth and stability, who'd make him feel valued rather than like a failure for being alone. He researched international marriage services with the same analytical approach he'd applied to investment decisions. He discovered an entire industry. Websites like Asian Beauty Date, Filipino Cupid, and Cherry Blossoms connecting Western men with Asian women, predominantly from Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. The marketing was explicit. Young, beautiful, traditional women seeking older, established Western men. Family-oriented values. Feminine demeanor. Grateful for opportunities unavailable in their home countries. Richard told himself this was different from sex tourism or exploitation. He was offering genuine relationship, life partnership security. The transactional nature was just realistic acknowledgement of how global economics shaped modern romance. These women wanted better lives, he wanted companionship. Where was the harm in mutual benefit? He joined Cherry Blossoms in September 2018, creating a profile that emphasized his financial stability, London property, and desire for traditional family life. His profile picture showed a reasonably attractive man for his age. Gray hair neatly trimmed, no beer belly, dressed in expensive casual clothes that signaled wealth without ostentation. The responses were immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of Filipino women messaged within the first week, all significantly younger, all beautiful, all expressing enthusiasm about his profile. Richard felt a rush of validation he hadn't experienced in years. These women found him attractive, interesting, desirable, everything British women his age supposedly didn't. He corresponded with several women, gradually narrowing his focus to those whose English was strongest and whose messages seemed most sincere. By November 2018, he'd begun intensive communication with 3 finalists, sending small gifts and conducting daily video calls to assess chemistry and compatibility. One of those 3 finalists was Angelica Santos, 26 years old, living in Manila, and perfectly calibrated to appeal to everything Richard desired and everything he failed to understand about the desperation driving her performance. Angelica Marie Santos was born in 1993 in Tonda, Manila, in a neighborhood where survival was the only ambition and where poverty reproduced itself with the ruthless efficiency of a virus. Her father left before she was born. Her mother, Teresa, worked in a garment factory earning 300 pesos daily, roughly $6, barely enough to rent their single room in a building that housed 40 families sharing 2 bathrooms. Angelica's childhood was defined by hunger managed through strategy, eating only once daily, drinking water to fill her stomach, stealing fruit from market vendors when hunger became unbearable. She attended public school irregularly, her education interrupted by needs to earn money helping her mother or caring for younger siblings born to different fathers who also vanished. By age 14, Angelica was working full-time in the same garment factory as her mother, her hands moving through fabric with speed born from necessity, her salary of 250 pesos daily buying rice and fish sauce that kept her family marginally functional. Her dreams, the ones she'd harbored as a child about becoming a teacher or nurse, had been killed by economic reality that made those professions accessible only to families with resources hers would never possess. At 16, Angelica caught the attention of a talent scout recruiting for a cultural exchange program that promised work in Japan. The reality was sex work, hostess bars where Filipino women entertained Japanese businessmen, with expectations extending well beyond conversation and karaoke. Angelica worked in Tokyo for 7 months before police raids on her establishment led to deportation back to Manila with a record that made legitimate international employment nearly impossible. Back in Tonda at 17 with deportation history and no legitimate job prospects, Angelica drifted into Manila's underground economy. She worked as a hostess at girly bars in Ermita where sex with clients was theoretically optional but practically mandatory for women who wanted to eat regularly. She escorted occasionally, framing it as dating rather than prostitution, though the transaction was identical. By 2015, at 22, Angelica had accumulated enough savings to attempt legitimacy. She enrolled in a hospitality training program, earned certification as a hotel receptionist, and secured employment at a mid-range hotel in Makati. The work was respectable, the salary insufficient. 12,000 pesos monthly couldn't cover rent, food, and the constant demands from family who viewed her previous sex work income as baseline they'd become dependent on. She supplemented hotel income with occasional escorting arranged through discreet channels. She told herself this was temporary, that she'd eventually save enough to quit entirely, that the respectable job was her real identity, while the sex work was just survival strategy she'd discard when circumstances improved. The circumstances never improved. They worsened. In 2016, Angelica met Roberto Cruz, a construction worker earning slightly more than she did. They married in a quick civil ceremony at Manila City Hall, their relationship based less on romance than on mutual recognition of poverty's crushing isolation. Roberto was not abusive or cruel. He was simply another poor person trying to survive, and together they were slightly better positioned than alone. The marriage was neither happy nor unhappy. It was functional. They shared a small apartment in Quezon City, split expenses, provided each other with the companionship that made poverty marginally more bearable. Roberto knew vaguely about Angelica's past work but asked no detailed questions because survival sometimes required strategic ignorance. But functional was not escape. By 2018, at 25, Angelica faced the reality that this was her life's ceiling. Hotel reception work supplemented by occasional escorting, a husband earning just enough to stay marginally above desperate poverty, and a future that looked identical to her present stretching endlessly forward until age and circumstance destroyed even these modest achievements. She wanted more. Not luxury exactly, but safety. The kind of security where unexpected expenses didn't trigger catastrophic crises. Where illness didn't mean choosing between food and medicine. where her future wasn't completely dependent on her body remaining young and desirable enough for the sex work that she desperately wanted to quit. A friend working the same hotel mentioned international marriage broker websites. "Foreign men pay for everything," she explained. "Visa, flight, housing. You marry them, get citizenship, then you can work legally abroad and send real money home. Some women even get divorced after getting citizenship and keep the benefits." The strategy was clear. Use marriage as immigration vehicle. Perform devotion long enough to secure visa and citizenship. Then either maintain the marriage if tolerable or exit once legal status was secured. Some women genuinely grew to love their foreign husbands. Others endured. The ones who escaped with citizenship and no children were considered the smart ones. Angelica researched obsessively. She learned that UK spousal visas required 2.5 years of marriage before citizenship application. She learned that divorce after citizenship wasn't uncommon and that British law entitled spouses to financial settlements. She learned that older wealthy men specifically sought Filipino women, viewing them as more traditional and feminine than British women their own age. She also learned that disclosing a previous marriage would disqualify her. Many countries required evidence of divorce before issuing spousal visas. But if the previous marriage was never disclosed, if it remained hidden in Manila City Hall records that British authorities wouldn't automatically check. In September 2018, Angelica created her Cherry Blossoms profile without mentioning Roberto, their marriage, or any of her survival work. Her profile presented carefully curated fiction. 25-year-old hotel receptionist, never married, from poor but respectable family, seeking older stable man for serious relationship leading to marriage. Her photos showed her natural beauty, delicate features, expressive eyes, slim figure, without heavy makeup or provocative clothing that might suggest sex work background. The responses flooded in. Dozens of Western men, predominantly aged 45 to 65, messaging with varying levels of desperation and entitlement. Angelica filtered systematically, looking for specific markers. Genuine wealth, age over 55, suggesting lower energy for investigating her background. Widower status, indicating experience with marriage and grief that might cloud judgment. And loneliness evident in how quickly they escalated to declarations of connection. Richard Thornton checked every box. His messages were grammatically correct but emotionally revealing. He discussed his late wife with grief that hadn't fully processed. He mentioned the Hampstead property and investment portfolio without explicit bragging but clear pride. Most importantly, he seemed genuinely lonely and eager to believe in romance rather than transaction. Angelica's approach was methodical. She responded to his messages with warmth but not excessive eagerness. She shared carefully edited details about her life. The hotel job, true. Her poor family, true. Her dreams of stability, true but strategically framed. She sent photos that showed her beauty but also in modest settings that suggested innocence rather than experience. Their video calls were performances on both sides. Richard performed the distinguished British gentleman, educated, cultured, financially secure. Angelica performed the grateful young Filipina, traditional, family-oriented, seeking rescue from poverty through devotion to a good man. Both performances were partially honest. Richard genuinely wanted companionship. Angelica genuinely wanted escape from poverty. But underneath the partial truths lay complete deceptions. Richard believed he was rescuing an innocent young woman who'd love him for himself rather than his money. Angelica knew she was executing an immigration strategy that required performing love she didn't feel for a man she'd never choose if poverty wasn't forcing the choice. By January 2019, they were discussing marriage. By March, Richard had flown to Manila to meet her family, coached beforehand on what stories to share, and propose formally. By May, they'd married in the Philippines at a ceremony attended by Angelica's family and none of Richard's friends who'd expressed concern about the age gap and speed of the relationship. The secret she carried, her existing marriage to Roberto, required careful management. Roberto was paid 100,000 pesos, roughly 1,500 pounds, to maintain silence and pretend they'd never been legally married. The wedding certificate was hidden with Angelica's mother. The risk of discovery seemed manageable compared to the reward of British citizenship and escape from poverty. Richard sponsored her UK spousal visa, demonstrating financial capacity and legitimate relationship through photos, communication records, and sworn statements. The visa was approved in July 2019. In August, Angelica landed at Heathrow as Mrs. Richard Thornton, arriving in a country she'd never visited to begin a marriage built entirely on mutual deception. She was 26 years old. She'd escaped Manila's poverty. She had 2.5 years to maintain her performance before citizenship application. She had no idea that within 18 months, her deception would be discovered and her life would end violently in a bedroom overlooking Hampstead Heath. The first 6 months were easier than Angelica had anticipated. The Hampstead townhouse was shockingly luxurious by her standards. Multiple bedrooms when her entire family in Manila lived in one room, heating that worked automatically rather than requiring careful rationing, and a kitchen with appliances she'd only seen in hotels. Richard was attentive if boring, treating her with the careful consideration of someone handling valuable property. Her duties were minimal. Richard didn't expect her to cook. He preferred his own bland British cuisine or takeaway from local restaurants. Cleaning was handled by a weekly service. She was essentially decorative wife, expected to accompany Richard to social events, smile appropriately, and demonstrate to his friends that he'd successfully moved past Catherine's death with an attractive young wife who appreciated his provision. Angelica played the role adequately. She attended dinner parties where Richard's colleagues made jokes about robbing the cradle and trading up to a younger model that Richard laughed at while Angelica performed graciousness. She accompanied him to theater performances she didn't understand and art gallery openings where she felt profoundly out of place. She endured sex that felt mechanical and joyless, Richard's aging body inspiring neither attraction nor revulsion, just tolerance as transaction required. But she maintained constant connection to her real life in Manila. She'd smuggled a second phone in her luggage, a device Richard didn't know existed. Through this phone, she communicated with Roberto, with her family, with friends from her previous life. She sent money home regularly, pound 200-300 monthly from the household allowance Richard provided, amounts he'd never miss but which transformed her family's circumstances. By January 2020, Angelica's discontent was growing. The Hampstead house felt like a beautiful prison. Richard's social circle treated her with condescending kindness, speaking slowly as if she were stupid rather than simply from a different background. The cultural isolation was crushing. She missed Manila's chaos, its noise, the familiarity of Tagalog conversations and food that actually tasted like home. She was counting days until citizenship eligibility. June 2022, 32 months away. The calculation consumed her. Every dinner party endured was one day closer. Every mechanical sex session was an investment in future freedom. Every performance of Grateful Young Wife was buying her ticket to permanent UK residence and the ability to either stay married on her terms or divorce with financial settlement. But maintaining the performance required relief valves. She connected with other Filipina women in London through social media, women who'd married British men through similar circumstances and understood the isolation without judgment. She attended Filipino Catholic Mass in South Kensington on Sundays when Richard thought she was at generic Anglican services. These connections provided crucial psychological survival, spaces where she could speak Tagalog, eat proper food, and be herself rather than performing the role Richard's money had purchased. Richard noticed her increasing distance but misinterpreted it as adjustment difficulty. He suggested they have children, believing parenthood would give Angelica purpose and cement their relationship. She delayed with excuses about wanting to feel more settled, but actually she was secretly taking contraception Richard didn't know about because pregnancy would complicate her exit strategy once citizenship was secured. The COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020 intensified their domestic tension. Lockdown trapped them together constantly. No dinner parties to distract, no galleries to visit, just endless days in the Hampstead house where Richard worked on investments while Angelica performed household tasks she found meaningless. Her resentment grew. She was 27 years old, living in luxury she couldn't enjoy, married to a man she didn't love, performing gratitude she didn't feel, while her real husband in Manila struggled alone because she was pursuing citizenship that was still 27 months away. She started skimming larger amounts from household funds. Richard gave her debit cards for household expenses, assuming she spent reasonably on groceries and personal items. Instead, Angelica systematically inflated expenses, claiming £300 for shopping that actually cost £150, pocketing the difference. She opened a secret bank account in her name only, accumulating funds for post-citizenship life whether she stayed married or divorced. By September 2020, she'd saved £8,000 in her hidden account. Money that would be impossible to explain if Richard discovered it, but which represented security independent of his control. She also intensified communication with Roberto. Their messages evolved from practical updates about family to something more emotional. Roberto had always been comfort rather than passion, but distance and misery made him seem more appealing than reality. Angelica started fantasizing about divorcing Richard once citizenship was secured, returning to Manila with enough money to buy a small business, reuniting with Roberto who represented authenticity even if he couldn't provide security. Roberto encouraged these fantasies because they gave him hope of his wife's return and access to the wealth she was accumulating. Their messages became more explicit. "I miss you. I still love you. Once you get citizenship, we can finally be together properly." Messages that Angelica saved in her secret phone without realizing they were creating evidence that would ultimately seal her fate. Richard remained oblivious to all this deception. He believed his marriage was successful, that Angelica had adjusted well despite pandemic challenges, that their relationship was genuine partnership rather than performance. His friends had stopped making jokes about the age gap. His stepdaughter from Catherine's first marriage had even visited and reported that Angelica seemed quite nice really. What Richard couldn't see was that his wife was counting days until citizenship eligibility with the fervor of a prisoner marking walls, that every smile was calculated, that she was systematically extracting money and planning exit strategies. The marriage was functioning on surface level while rotting completely underneath. Both parties were performing roles while pursuing separate agendas. The collision was inevitable. It was just a question of what would trigger the discovery. The trigger came in February 2021, 17 months into the marriage, from the most mundane source: a forgotten phone charger and a husband's casual curiosity. On the evening of March 6, 2021, Angelica made a critical error. Her secret phone's battery died while she was messaging Roberto, and in her distraction, she left it charging in the master bedroom's ensuite bathroom instead of her usual hiding place in her clothing drawer. She'd gone downstairs to prepare dinner when Richard went upstairs to change clothes. The phone was sitting on the bathroom counter, charging, unlocked because Angelica had been using it minutes before. Richard noticed it immediately. Not his wife's regular iPhone, but an older model Samsung he'd never seen. His first thought was confusion rather than suspicion. Had Angelica bought a new phone without mentioning it? He picked it up to examine it, and the screen lit up showing an open messaging app. The most recent conversation was with someone labeled M, Angelica's code for Roberto, using his middle name. The message preview on the screen read, "Only 15 more months until I can apply for citizenship. Then I can come home to you properly. I miss you so much, mahal kayo." Richard's stomach dropped. Mahal kayo? He didn't speak Tagalog, but he'd heard Angelica use that phrase in Filipino conversations, and context suggested it meant my love, or similar endearment. Who was she messaging about coming home once she got citizenship? He scrolled upward, reading weeks of messages that systematically destroyed every assumption he'd built his marriage upon. Angelica discussing her counting of days until citizenship. Angelica describing their marriage as tolerable, and Richard as boring but harmless. Angelica and this M person discussing their future together once this is all done. Most devastatingly, he found messages from January 2021 where Angelica and M reminisced about their wedding in 2016. Their wedding, before Angelica had even met Richard. His hands shaking, Richard clicked through to photo galleries. Images of Angelica significantly younger, standing beside a Filipino man, wearing a wedding dress at Manila City Hall. Dated April 15, 2016. She'd been married for 3 years before meeting Richard. She was still married. Their entire relationship was fraud. He scrolled further, finding banking app screenshots showing the secret account, finding messages where Angelica discussed how much money she'd skimmed and how much more she needed to make this worth all the suffering, finding messages where she and M discussed exactly how long after getting citizenship she should wait before divorcing Richard to maximize financial settlement. The phone contained 2.5 years of deception mapped in painful detail. Every "I love you" she'd said to Richard was lies. Every smile was performance. Every intimate moment was prostitution by another name, paid for in visa sponsorship and household allowance rather than hourly rates. Richard felt something break inside him. Not just his heart, but his fundamental sense of reality. He believed he was rescuing a grateful young woman who genuinely cared for him despite their age difference. He defended their marriage to skeptical friends, insisting it was real love transcending economics. He'd imagined them growing old together, eventually having children, building authentic partnership. All of it was lies. He was just a visa, pension plan, a gullible old man who'd been so desperate for validation that he'd bought into an obvious scam. His humiliation was compounded by realization of how completely he'd been fooled. The friends who'd expressed concern had been right. His stepdaughter who'd seemed skeptical had been right. Everyone had probably known except him, the pathetic widower so lonely he'd fallen for the most transparent deception imaginable. Rage built slowly but comprehensively. This wasn't just heartbreak. It was theft. Angelica had stolen years of his life, stolen his money, stolen his dignity, and committed immigration fraud that made him accomplice to her crime. If authorities discovered the bigamous marriage, Richard could face legal consequences for sponsoring fraudulent visa application. He took Angelica's secret phone and returned to his study, locking the door. He spent the next 3 hours reading every message, viewing every photo, documenting every detail of her deception. He created a timeline on his computer. April 2016. Angelica marries Roberto Cruz in Manila. September 2018. She joins Cherry Blossoms without disclosing marriage. November 2018. She begins targeting Richard specifically. March 2019. She marries Richard bigamously. July 2019. Fraudulent spousal visa approved based on declarations that she'd never been previously married. The legal implications were staggering. Bigamy was criminal offense in UK carrying up to 7 years imprisonment. Visa fraud could result in deportation, permanent ban from UK, and potentially criminal charges against Richard for sponsoring application containing material misrepresentations. But more than legal consequences, Richard fixated on the betrayal. He'd given Angelica everything, brought her from poverty to Hampstead luxury, provided security, citizenship pathway, generous allowance, treated her with respect and affection. And she'd been laughing at him the entire time, counting days until she could extract divorce settlement and return to her real husband. By midnight, Richard's rage had crystallized into decision. He would confront Angelica in the morning. He would expose her fraud. He would contact immigration authorities and police. He would destroy her schemes completely, ensuring she faced consequences for deceiving him. What he didn't acknowledge to himself was that underneath the righteous fury lay something darker. The humiliated rage of a man whose money and status had failed to purchase what he believed they entitled him to. He'd paid for devotion and received performance. He'd bought what he thought was love and discovered it was strategic prostitution. His wealth, which had always solved problems before, had made him target rather than savior. Richard barely slept that night, lying beside Angelica while she slumbered peacefully, unaware that her deception had been discovered. He watched her sleeping face, which seemed beautiful and innocent in darkness, and felt the vertigo of reality splitting completely from appearance. Everything he'd believed about his marriage was fiction. The woman sleeping beside him was a stranger, an actress, a fraud who'd been exploiting him with calculation he'd been too arrogant or desperate to see. By 5 a.m. on March 7th, Richard had decided how the confrontation would proceed. He'd present the evidence calmly, demand explanation, then notify authorities regardless of whatever story she attempted. She'd be deported, potentially criminally charged, destroyed professionally and legally. It wouldn't restore what she'd stolen from him, but it would ensure she faced consequences. What Richard didn't anticipate was how confrontation would escalate, how his humiliated rage would override his control, and how hands that had once caressed his wife with affection would become instruments of murder. Angelica woke at 6:15 a.m. on March 8, 2021, to find Richard sitting in the bedroom's reading chair, fully dressed, staring at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of the affection or indifference that usually characterized his gaze. On the bedside table, arranged like evidence presentation, were her secret phone, printed screenshots of messages, and documents she didn't immediately recognize. "We need to talk," Richard said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "About your marriage, your real marriage, to Roberto Cruz, in April 2016, before you ever met me." The blood drained from Angelica's face. Her survival instinct screamed at her to run, but she was in pajamas, barefoot, in a house in a foreign country where she had no resources independent of the man confronting her with evidence of her deception. "Richard, I can explain," she began, but he cut her off. "You're still married to him. You committed bigamy when you married me. You committed visa fraud when you applied for spousal visa claiming you'd never been married. You've been stealing from our household accounts, skimming money for nearly 2 years, and you've been planning to divorce me the moment you secured citizenship, return to your real husband, and take as much of my money as possible in settlement." He gestured to the documents, his hand shaking slightly despite his controlled tone. "I read everything, every message, every plan, every joke you made about how boring I am, how tolerable this marriage is, how you're just counting days until citizenship. Every discussion of how long you need to wait after citizenship to maximize divorce settlement. Everything." Angelica's mind raced through response options. Deny? Impossible with this much evidence. Apologize? Would it matter? Flee? Where would she go with no money, no passport? Richard controlled all their documents. No one in London who could help. She chose partial truth laced with strategic emotion. "I'm sorry. I was desperate. My family was starving. I didn't know what else to do. I did lie about my first marriage, but I do care about you, Richard. These messages make it sound worse than it is. Roberto and I aren't really together anymore." "Stop lying," Richard interrupted, his voice rising. "Just stop. I've read months of messages. I know exactly what this is. I'm not some elderly fool you can manipulate with pretty words and fake tears. I gave you everything, Angelica. Everything. And you were just using me, stealing from me, laughing at me with your real husband. You don't understand what poverty is like," Angelica said, her own anger emerging despite fear. "You sit here in your £1,000,000 house judging me for survival choices, but you've never gone hungry. You've never had to choose between food and medicine. You've never had your entire future determined by economic circumstances you didn't choose. Yes, I lied. Yes, I married you for visa. But you used me too, Richard. You wanted young, beautiful wife to show off to your friends, to make yourself feel virile again after Catherine died. We were both using each other. The only difference is you have the power to destroy me and I never had power to destroy you." The truth of her words landed like physical blow. Richard recognized that she was partially correct. He had wanted trophy wife, had wanted to feel desired and powerful, had chosen a desperately poor young woman specifically because her circumstances made her pliable and grateful. But acknowledging complicity in the transactional nature of their marriage would require examining his own motivations in ways that his humiliation couldn't tolerate. "I'm calling immigration authorities and police," Richard said, standing and moving toward the door. "You'll be deported, likely criminally charged. Your family will lose everything I've sent them. And I'll make sure every international marriage broker knows your name, your picture, and exactly what you did. You'll never scam another man." The threat to her family triggered something desperate in Angelica. The money she'd sent home had paid for her youngest brother's education, her mother's medical treatment, their move out of Tonda slum. If authorities reclaimed that money, her family would be destroyed financially and blamed her for raising hopes before devastating them. "Please don't do that," she begged, moving toward Richard with hands raised in supplication. "Deport me if you want. But don't destroy my family. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't know about Roberto. Please, Richard, I'm begging you. Your family benefited from fraud, Richard replied. They're accomplices. They'll face consequences too. Angelica grabbed his arm, her desperation overriding awareness of boundaries. I'll do anything. I'll stay married to you. I'll never mention citizenship or divorce. I'll be whatever you want me to be. Just don't destroy my family. Richard jerked his arm away with violence that surprised both of them. You think I'd stay married to you after this? You think I want a fraud for a wife? You're disgusting. You're a prostitute who figured out long-term scam pays better than hourly rates. I wouldn't touch you again if you begged. The word prostitute, delivered with such contempt, triggered Angelica's own rage. She'd endured 17 months of performing devotion to a boring, wealthy man, smiled through condescending dinner parties, spread her legs for a body she found undesirable, sacrificed her youth and dignity for a visa, and now he was calling her disgusting? At least I'm honest about what I am, she spat back. You're the pathetic one, 60 years old, buying a wife because women your age can see how empty you are. Catherine probably died to escape you. You're not a victim, Richard. You're a sad old man who thought money could make someone love you. The mention of Catherine, delivered with such calculated cruelty, was the trigger that transformed confrontation into violence. Richard's hand moved before his consciousness registered the decision. Palm open, striking Angelica's face with force that snapped her head sideways and split her lip. She stumbled backward, shock and pain registering simultaneously. Blood trickled from her mouth. She stared at Richard with terror replacing anger, finally understanding that this confrontation was more dangerous than she'd calculated. I'm leaving, she said, moving toward the bedroom door. I'm going to the Philippine embassy. I'll turn myself in for visa fraud before you can destroy me and my family. Richard blocked her path, his larger body and righteous fury overwhelming her smaller frame. You're not going anywhere. You're going to face consequences here. What happened next occurred in minutes but would replay in Richard's mind for the rest of his life. Angelica tried to push past him. He grabbed her arms to restrain her. She kicked at him, connecting with his shin, her survival instinct overriding strategic submission. He shoved her backward. She fell against the bedside table, knocking documents and her secret phone to the floor. She scrambled on hands and knees trying to reach her phone, perhaps to call embassy or police, to get help before this escalated further. Richard stepped on her hand, crushing her fingers against the hardwood floor. She screamed. The sound triggered something in him. Rage at being made to feel like aggressor when he was actually victim, humiliation about being exposed as fool, grief about Catherine transformed into fury at this woman who'd exploited his vulnerability. He pulled Angelica up by her hair, her scream cutting off as she clutched at his hands. They struggled, both operating on pure adrenaline and emotion. Angelica clawed at his face, drawing blood. Richard's hands moved to her throat, initially just trying to control her, to stop her screaming and fighting. But once his hands were around her throat, muscle memory from decades of working out at gyms took over. He squeezed. Angelica's eyes went wide with terror. She grabbed at his wrists, her nails digging into his skin, her body thrashing. But Richard was larger, stronger, and possessed by rage that eclipsed rationality. You used me, he said through gritted teeth, squeezing harder. You stole from me. You made me look like a fool. You deserve this. Angelica's struggles weakened. Her face turned red, then purple. Her hands fell from his wrists to hang limply at her sides. Richard continued squeezing, past the point where she stopped struggling, past the point where she lost consciousness, continuing until he was absolutely certain she couldn't resurrect herself to testify against him. When he finally released her throat, Angelica's body crumpled to the floor. Her eyes were open but unseeing. Blood vessels burst from strangulation pressure. Her neck bore clear ligature marks from his hands. Her body was utterly still. Richard stepped backward, breathing heavily, staring at what he'd done. The rage that had possessed him drained away, leaving only horrified clarity. He'd murdered his wife, in his own bedroom, in broad daylight, Because she'd deceived him about her immigration status and marriage history. The justifications he'd constructed. She deserved consequences. She was criminal who defrauded him. She'd stolen his money and dignity. Now seemed utterly inadequate to explain the corpse at his feet. He sat in the reading chair, staring at Angelica's body, and experienced the same vertigo he'd felt discovering her deception. Reality splitting completely from what he'd believed it to be. He'd thought of himself as victim. Now he was murderer. He'd thought he was administering justice. Now he'd committed crime far worse than anything Angelica had done. At 6:47 a.m., Richard called 999, his voice calm and mechanical, reporting his own crime before his survival instinct could suggest alternatives like hiding the body or constructing alibis. "I've killed my wife. I'd like to report a murder. My own. I'm the perpetrator." The murder trial of Richard William Thornton began in September 2021 at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court. The case attracted significant media attention due to its sensational elements. Wealthy pensioner, impoverished foreign bride, immigration fraud, and domestic homicide. The tabloids had a field day with headlines like "Millionaire Strangled Scam Bride" and "Fatal Romance." When love was just a visa, the prosecution's case was straightforward. Richard Thornton had murdered his wife during domestic dispute, using lethal force disproportionate to any threat she posed. Forensic evidence was overwhelming. Ligature marks consistent with manual strangulation, Richard's DNA under Angelica's fingernails from defensive wounds, and Richard's own confession to police. The prosecution presented Richard as an entitled wealthy man who'd turned violent when confronted with his wife's agency and deception. Yes, Angelica had committed visa fraud and bigamy, but those crimes didn't justify murder. Richard could have reported her to authorities and pursued legal remedies. Instead, he'd killed her. Character witnesses described Angelica's difficult background, her family's poverty, and the impossible choices that economic desperation created. Psychologists testified about survival sex work and immigration fraud as rational responses to structural inequality rather than moral failings. The prosecution painted Angelica as an imperfect victim, someone who'd made unethical choices, but whose flaws didn't justify death. The defense strategy was more complex. Richard's barrister argued diminished responsibility due to extreme emotional distress. Richard had discovered his entire marriage was fraud, that he'd been systematically deceived and robbed, that his wife was planning to extract divorce settlement after securing citizenship through bigamous marriage. Any reasonable person would experience extreme emotional distress under those circumstances. The defense presented expert testimony about the psychological impact of discovering such comprehensive betrayal. Richard had been vulnerable, recently widowed, lonely, desperate for companionship. Angelica had exploited that vulnerability systematically through an international marriage scam industry. When confronted with the full scope of her deception, Richard had experienced acute stress reaction that temporarily impaired his judgment. The defense didn't argue that Richard's actions were justified, but that his mental state at the time of killing met the legal standard for diminished responsibility, which would reduce the charge from murder to manslaughter. Character witnesses for Richard described him as gentle, generous, never previously violent. Colleagues from his banking career testified that he'd been reliable and professional across 3 decades. His late wife's relatives described a devoted husband who'd cared for Catherine through her final illness with tenderness and patience. The defense presented Richard as a fundamentally decent man who'd suffered catastrophic break under extraordinary circumstances, discovering that his wife, his marriage, and his future were all elaborate fraud designed to steal his money and citizenship. But the prosecution's cross-examination was devastating. They presented evidence that Richard had essentially purchased a bride through international marriage broker, that he'd specifically sought young impoverished woman because her circumstances made her dependent and compliant. They showed messages from Richard's cherry blossoms profile emphasizing his desire for traditional and grateful wife, coded language for someone who wouldn't challenge his authority. Most damningly, they presented forensic evidence about the duration of the strangulation. Richard hadn't killed Angelica in moment of rage. He'd strangled her for approximately 3 to 4 minutes, continuing well past the point where she'd lost consciousness. That duration indicated sustained lethal intent rather than temporary loss of control. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Jury deliberations took 4 days, suggesting significant disagreement among jurors about whether Richard's emotional distress sufficiently diminished his responsibility for killing. The verdict delivered on October 15, 2021. Guilty of murder, not manslaughter. The jury had rejected the diminished responsibility defense, concluding that Richard's rage, though understandable, didn't legally excuse the sustained violence that had killed Angelica. He'd made a choice to continue strangling her past the point of her losing consciousness, past the point where she posed any threat. That choice reflected intent to kill rather than temporary impairment of judgment. Sentencing occurred 2 weeks later. The judge's remarks were measured but damning. This case involves a tragic collision of vulnerabilities and exploitations. Mrs. Thornton committed serious crimes, bigamy and immigration fraud. She deceived you systematically for financial gain. Your discovery of that deception caused profound emotional distress that the court acknowledges. However, you responded to that distress with lethal violence against a woman who posed no physical threat to you. You strangled her for several minutes, continuing past the point where she'd lost consciousness. You made a choice to kill her rather than pursuing legal remedies available to you. Additionally, this court notes the power imbalance that existed throughout your relationship. You specifically sought a young, impoverished foreign woman through international marriage broker. You held her passport, controlled her finances, and possessed all legal authority in the marriage. When she exercised the limited agency available to her through deception, you responded by eliminating her entirely. The sentence for murder is life imprisonment. I set the minimum term at 20 years before eligibility for parole consideration. At age 60, this effectively means you will likely die in prison. Richard showed no emotion during sentencing. He was remanded immediately to HMP Belmarsh to begin serving his sentence. The case sparked significant debate about international marriage brokers, immigration fraud, and gendered violence. Feminist organizations used Richard's trial to highlight how commodification of marriage created conditions for abuse, wealthy men purchasing access to vulnerable women, then turning violent when those women's survival strategies became visible. Immigrant rights advocates emphasized the structural inequality driving women like Angelica into fraud. They argued that if legal immigration pathways existed for poor Filipinos seeking better economic opportunities, women wouldn't need to lie about marriage history or pretend affection for men they didn't love. Conservative commentators focused on immigration fraud, arguing that Angelica's deception justified harsh consequences and that Richard was as much victim as perpetrator. Some men's rights forums lionized Richard as someone who defended himself against marriage scam, minimizing the murder or suggesting it was justified. The Cherry Blossoms marriage broker website faced scrutiny but continued operating. International marriage brokerage remained legal in UK despite concerns that the industry facilitated exploitation and fraud. Thousands of men continued seeking young foreign brides through similar services, and thousands of impoverished women continued using those services as immigration vehicles. Angelica's family in Manila received nothing from her death. The money she'd sent home over 17 months, approximately £8,000, was not reclaimed by authorities, but the flow stopped completely after her murder. Her mother Teresa blamed herself for encouraging her daughter into overseas work that had ultimately killed her. Her husband Roberto faced no legal consequences for his role in the bigamy scheme, but carried guilt about encouraging Angelica's citizenship plan that had ended in murder. The secret bank account Angelica had accumulated £8,000 saved through her systematic skimming was discovered during the investigation. The money was frozen as proceeds of fraud. Eventually, it was divided between Roberto, as her legal husband, and her family, providing modest financial cushion that Angelica had intended to build through additional years of deception. Richard served 3 years at HMP Belmarsh before being transferred to lower security HMP Prescott in Wales. Reports from prison authorities describe him as model prisoner. Quiet, compliant, no disciplinary issues. He reportedly spends his time reading, attending prison education programs, and avoiding discussion of his crime. His minimum term of 20 years means potential parole eligibility in 2041, when he'd be 80 years old. Prison psychologists note that Richard continues to view himself primarily as victim of fraud rather than perpetrator of murder. He has expressed regret that Angelica died, but continues to emphasize that her deception drove him to actions he wouldn't have otherwise taken. The Hampstead townhouse was sold in 2022 to pay legal fees and victim compensation. The property fetched £4.8 million, representing significant appreciation from the £780,000 Richard and Catherine had paid in 1998. After legal expenses and compensation to Angelica's family, £100,000 mandated by court, the remaining funds were placed in trust for Richard's stepdaughter from Catherine's first marriage. The case became textbook example in law schools discussing diminished responsibility defenses, in sociology courses examining mail-order bride industries, and in immigration policy debates about visa fraud and structural inequality. For years later, both Richard and Angelica are reduced to case studies, their complex humanity flattened into legal principles and political arguments. He's the entitled murderer or the fraud victim, depending on who's telling the story. She's the exploited survivor or the calculating scammer, with similar variation based on narrator perspective. The truth, as always, is more complicated than either simplified narrative. Richard was both victim of fraud and perpetrator of murder. Angelica was both strategic deceiver and desperate survivor. Their marriage was both genuine transaction and tragic collision of incompatible needs. What remains undeniable is that on March 8, 2021, in a Hampstead bedroom overlooking one of London's wealthiest neighborhoods, a 60-year-old man strangled his 28-year-old wife to death because her survival choices had humiliated him and threatened his wealth. One body in a morgue, one man in prison, two families destroyed, and an industry that continues matching wealthy Western men with impoverished foreign women, selling romance while delivering transaction, promising love while producing exploitation. The marriage broker websites still operate. The visa applications still get filed. The age gap relationships still get formed. And somewhere, right now, another lonely wealthy man is messaging another desperate poor woman. Both performing for each other, both lying about their motives, both heading toward a collision that will destroy one or both of them. Remember Angelica Santos. Remember that poverty forces choices that privileged people call fraud. Remember that immigration restrictions create black markets where human lives become commodities. Remember that male entitlement to female submission turns lethal when women exercise agency through the only methods available to them. Share this story to expose the international marriage industry's exploitation. Subscribe to support investigations of gendered violence. Comment to show that we remember victims like Angelica whose survival strategies made them targets for men who believed money had purchased obedience. Your engagement keeps these stories visible and demands accountability from industries that profit from inequality.